I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart. In my heart I have but one desire, and that one is you. No other will do.
Thank you for joining us for our presentation, The Daily Mail Demolition Derby of 1919. In this presentation, we recount the story of how 4 teams of aviators tried to achieve the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1919. They were motivated by their patriotic and religious ideals, as well as a £10,000 reward offered by the London Daily Mail newspaper. This historic event also produced some of the most valuable and rare aerophilatelic items in the world. We chose the title of this presentation to reflect the fact that the 1919 transatlantic flight challenge was a very destructive one for the planes involved. None of the planes escaped without crashing, and some even crashed multiple times. Our story takes place in 1919, but we first need to go back to late in 1903 when the Wright brothers made the first powered flight of an airplane near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. This achievement put the United States at the forefront of aviation. However, in the following years, Europe surpassed the United States in aeronautical innovation. This was mainly due to the lack of U.S. government support for aviation and the initiatives of some influential individuals in Europe who promoted aviation there. A key figure in promoting aviation in Europe was Ernest Archdeacon from France. He was a rich lawyer who helped to establish the Aero Club of France in 1904. As the leader of the Aero Club, he offered a number of cash prizes to reward aviation achievements. One of the people who tried to win the Aero Club prizes was Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian-born aviation pioneer. He flew his biplane 14 bis in a field near Paris in the autumn of 1906. It looked more like a giant kite than an airplane, but it flew. Santos Dumont made the first powered flight of an airplane outside the U.S., and it was the first flight ever seen by a crowd of people. One of the people who saw Santos Dumont's flight in 1906 was Alfred Harmsworth, the first Viscount Northcliffe. He was a rich British newspaper owner who had 2 London daily newspapers, the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror. He was amazed by Santos Dumont's achievement and said,
"A man with a heavier-than-air machine has flown. It does not matter how far he has flown. He has shown what can be done. In a year's time, mark my words, that fellow will be flying over here from France. Britain is no longer an island. Nothing so important has happened for a very long time."
Viscount Northcliffe became even more interested in aviation when he went to the first international air show that took place in Reims, France, in 1909. In 1910, his Daily Mail, which had started to offer cash prizes for aviation in 1906, announced a huge prize of £10,000 for the first person to fly from London to Manchester. This made the public in Britain even more excited about aviation than ever before. A major factor that helped aviation to advance in the British Isles was the creation of big British aerodromes. These were places where people who loved aviation could meet, fly their planes, and share ideas. The public could also watch flying shows and competitions. Some of the pilots became famous and well known. One of the most important British airfields was at Brooklands, near Weybridge, 20 miles southwest of London. Brooklands was the first racetrack for cars in the world, built in July 1907. But soon an airstrip was added in the middle of the track, and hangars were made for storing planes. Later, flying schools and even some plane factories were set up at Brooklands. As part of its series of aviation prizes, the Daily Mail announced a £10,000 prize on April Fool's Day 1913 for the most daring flight ever, for the first plane to cross the Atlantic Ocean either way between North America and the British Isles or Ireland in less than 72 hours. People thought it was a joke because no planes could fly that far then. The next year, World War I started, and the prize offer was forgotten. The Daily Mail renewed the prize offer in 1918 when the war was almost over. During the war, planes and engines had improved a lot. By 1918, flying across the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Ireland was deemed to be just possible with bravery and luck. Newfoundland was a good place to start a transatlantic flight in 1919, but it also had many problems. There were no airfields on the island because no plane had ever been there. The land was often rough and rocky, and it was hard to find a good place to build a temporary airfield. And the weather could be very bad. The warm and cold currents in the sea made thick fogs that covered the sky up to 3,000 feet elevation. There were also many clouds, rain, strong winds, and storms with big up and down currents. The cold could also make ice on the planes and make them hard to control. Flying across the Atlantic would take hours of flying in the dark, so it was better to have a full moon. But this only happened for less than a week every month. And the worst thing was, they could not tell what the weather would be like over the Atlantic because they did not have good ways to forecast it. The last thing that made transatlantic flying so hard was the planes. They were mostly weak biplanes with fabric or wood covers, wooden struts, and wire rigging. And the engines were cooled by water, which needed radiators, pipes, and consequently a sizable water load. The end of World War I in 1918 sparked a renewed interest in the transatlantic contest, with 17 groups, including 5 from America, declaring their intention to participate. However, by the spring of 1919, only 4 groups, all British, remained in the race. They were sponsored by the aircraft manufacturers Sopwith, Martinsyde, Handley Page, and Vickers. They had made large profits from building warplanes and now wanted to promote their products for commercial use. The best way to do that was to win a prestigious long-distance flight competition. The 4 competing planes reflected 2 different strategies for crossing the Atlantic. One strategy was to use a single-engine plane, which was lighter and simpler. The Sopwith Atlantic and Martinsyde Raymore followed this approach. The other strategy was to use a larger plane with multiple engines, which provided more power and reliability. The Handley Page Atlantic and the Vickers Atlantic Vimy adopted this approach. The single-engine planes were the first to reach Newfoundland. The Sopwith group arrived on March 10th and secured a good spot for their aerodrome at Glendinning's farm near St. John's at Mount Pearl. The Martinsyde group came a month later, on April 11th and had to settle for a less ideal location on the shore of Kitty Vitty Lake, east of St. John's. The two-man crews of the single-engine planes were both led by chief test pilots. The Sopwith Atlantic was flown by Harry Hawker, an Australian mechanic who moved to England in 1912 and joined the Sopwith Company. He learned to fly and became the top test pilot with his natural skills. His navigator was Kenneth Grieve, a Royal Navy veteran. The Martinzide Raymore was named after the first part of the crew's last names. The pilot was Freddie Raynham, who had been flying instructor at Brooklands before joining Martinzide. He was a friend and a rival of Hawker in racing. The navigator was Charles Morgan, who claimed to be a descendant of the famous British buccaneer Sir Henry Morgan. The Postmaster General of Newfoundland, J. Alex Robinson, decided it would be a nice gesture to give Newfoundlanders a chance to send airmail greetings to their friends across the ocean. So on April 5th, he contacted the Sopwith Group, the only one on the island at the time, and made a deal on April 10th. The Sopwith plane would carry 10 official letters and up to 100 non-official letters on their flight. 2 days later, special stamps, Scott C1, for the Sopwith flight were ready at the post office. They were 3-cent stamps of the 1919 Trail of the Caribou issue with an overprint, First Transatlantic Air Post, April 1919, on the front, and the initials of the Postmaster General written on the back. Only 200 stamps were overprinted, but 18 were damaged and destroyed, leaving 182 stamps for sale. The Sopwith covers were postmarked April 12th. After the sale, there were 87 stamps left. The Postmaster General gave 11 of them as gifts and bought the remaining 76 for himself. He then sold them to the public for $25 each and donated the money to the Permanent Marine Disasters Fund, a charity that helped the families of sailors who died at sea. Today there are about the same number of mint as used C1 stamps. The Martinzide Group arrived the day after Robinson made the mail agreement with the Sopwith Group. Initiating mail negotiations with the Martinzide Group seemed a moot point because the Sopwith plane was supposed to leave soon. But bad weather set in, preventing any flight attempts for a month. Before the weather cleared, the Martinzide Group was able to get their plane ready. This put Postmaster Robinson in a bind. He didn't know which plane would fly first. So he had to arrange mail for the Martinzide plane too, and he had to do it quickly. He used another batch of 3-cent Caribou stamps with the handwritten notation on them, Aerial Atlantic Mail, and his initials JAR below, creating Scott C1A. Unlike the Sopwith stamps, the Martinzide stamps in mint were not sold to the public. They were kept in the post office for use there. People brought their covers in without stamps, paid the postage, and then the postal clerk put the stamps on them and canceled them later. About 40 covers were made with the C1A stamp, usually postmarked April 19th. From what has been said before, one would not expect to encounter any mint Martinzide provisionals. In fact, only one is known, and it was preserved by a quirk of fate. It's on piece, taken from the cover of a letter that pilot Freddie Raynham wrote to his relatives in England. Raynham wanted to send the letter by airmail across the Atlantic. He entered the post office, paid the postage, and the clerk placed the stamp on his letter. As he was leaving the building, he met a friend who told him something he wanted to add to the letter. So he got his letter back from the clerk, bearing the uncancelled stamp, and expected to return it later. But he forgot to return it, and took it with him to England in his pocket. Years later, he sold the stamp on piece without a postmark, apologizing to the buyer for the stamp not having a cancellation. Most Raymore covers have a 3-cent caribou provisional, but one 2-cent and one 5-cent caribou so marked are also known on cover. Another fascinating cover appears to have been initially a Sopwith cover, franked with a Sopwith provisional, and then later franked with a Martinzide provisional and recanceled April 30th. Note the autograph by Raymore navigator C.W.F. Morgan. The Americans also wanted to fly across the Atlantic by airplane as part of a well-financed and well-organized national effort. They used 4 U.S. Navy Curtiss flying boats with 4 engines each, called NC-1 to NC-4, or Nancy's, as they were nicknamed. They also had more than 50 naval ships along the ocean route to help them. The Nancy's were slow, and the plan was to fly across in legs: Long Island to Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland, to the Azores, to Lisbon, to Plymouth. They would not win the Daily Mail prize because their flight would take more than 72 hours. But they wanted to be first across the Atlantic. The Nancy started from the naval station in Rahway, New Jersey. In New Jersey, it was necessary to take parts from the NC-2 plane to repair other planes and leave that NC-2 behind. The other 3 planes left on May 8th and reached Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland, on May 15th. The next day, they departed for the Azores. The departure of the Americans rattled the Brits. They hurried to depart even though the weather was not ideal. The first to go was the Sopwith Atlantic, which took off at 3:15 in the afternoon on May 18th against a strong wind. An hour later, the Raymore was ready to leave. The wind was still blowing the same way as it had for the Atlantic, but the Raymore's lakeside airstrip was not aligned well with the wind direction. Raynham, hoping to catch up with Hawker and Grieve, decided to try the takeoff anyway. The plane got up to about 100 feet, but a crosswind pushed it down to the ground, ripping off the undercarriage and bringing it to a stop. Luckily, they did not catch fire, in accordance with our song at the beginning. Raynham was slightly hurt, but Morgan suffered a bad eye injury that ended his flying career. All attention now turned to Hawker and Grieve flying out over the ocean towards Ireland. The flight should have taken less than a day, but no one heard from them or saw them for days. They must have crashed into the ocean and probably died. The British people were stunned, and the king sent his sympathy to Mrs. Hawker. But she did not give up hope and believed that her Harry was still alive. It turns out she was right. The Atlantic flew halfway across the ocean, but then its engines started to overheat, probably because of a blockage in the cooling system. When they were about 850 miles from Ireland, they realized that the engine would stop working soon, either from running out of fuel or water, which was evaporating because of the heat. Hawker made a critical decision to turn south and look for a ship to save them. He used the rest of their flying time to zigzag along the shipping lanes. The crew spotted a Danish cargo ship, the SS Mary, and landed in the water about 200 yards in front of it. The sea was rough, and it took an hour and a half to get the flyers on board the ship. The weather was too bad to rescue the mailbag or the plane, which was left floating nose down with a white shirt tied to its tail. The SS Mary had no radio, and no one knew that the flyers were safe until they reached Scotland on the 25th, a week after they had left Newfoundland. Miraculously, the still floating Atlantic was picked up on May 23rd by a U.S. ship, the SS Lake Charlottesville, along with its mailbag. They took them to Falmouth, England. The stamps had been soaked off the covers, but the captain of the ship had dried the mail and had dutifully put the stamps back on. It has been rumored that he later got a job with Stanley Gibbons. Despite their failure to win the contest, Hawker and Grieve were welcomed as heroes when they came back to England. Harry Hawker was one of the most loved flyers in England then. They met the King, who gave them the Air Force Cross, and Lord Northcliffe also gave them a $5,000 prize for flying more than 1,000 miles over the open ocean. The wrecked plane was hoisted up to the roof of Selfridge's department store in London and put on display. A few days before the Sopwith and Martinsyde flight attempts, the Handley Page Group became the first of the multi-engine plane entrants to arrive in Newfoundland. The company took its name from the middle and last names of its founder, Frederick Handley Page, an electrical engineer. Their plane, Atlantic, had 6 crew members, the only plane in the race to have more than 2. It was a huge 4-engine plane that was modified from an O-1500 Super Handley, the biggest bomber of World War I, with a wingspan of 126 feet. The Atlantic's engines were mounted back-to-back in 2 pairs. It needed a long runway to take off, so they chose a place near Harbor Grace, about 60 miles from St. John's. The locals helped them clear the area needed for takeoff, even moving some houses. The Handley Page crew had 3 key members, Brackley, Carr, and Gran. Rear Admiral Carr had 3 roles. He was the leader, the spokesperson, and the co-pilot. The last group to join the race was the Vickers Group, who arrived 2 weeks after the Handley Page Group. The Vickers plane was a 2-engine model with a wingspan about half that of the Handley Page. It was based on the design of a World War I bomber, the Vickers Vimy, but it was not an old warplane. It was specially built from parts left over at the Vickers factory at Brooklands in early 1919. It was called the Atlantic Vimy. The crew of the Atlantic Vimy was pilot John Alcock and navigator Arthur Brown. Alcock learned to fly at Brooklands and was a friend and colleague of Freddie Raynham and Harry Hawker. During World War I, he was initially a flight instructor, but later flew bombers in the Dardanelles. Brown also flew in World War I. He was an air observer. Brown's plane was shot down in 1915, and he received injuries that gave him a permanent limp. He spent 2 years in POW camps. During that time, he taught himself aerial navigation using books he obtained through the Red Cross. The Martinsyde, Handley Page, and Vickers were the only planes left in the race by the end of May. They were all being prepared to fly. Meanwhile, the Americans were still flying slowly across the Atlantic. On the way from Newfoundland to the Azores, they hit fog, and 2 of their planes, the NC-1 and NC-3, had to land on the water and were damaged. The only plane that made it, the NC-4, reached Plymouth on May 31st, 15 days after leaving Newfoundland. This made the NC-4 the first plane to fly across the Atlantic, though it did it in several hops. The Newfoundland government took advantage of the lull and reached the decision to make a general airmail stamp for all subsequent attempts to cross the Atlantic in 1919. They overprinted 10,000 15-cent stamps from the 1897 Cabot issue. Transatlantic Air Post, 1919, $1, in black, creating Scott C2. The overprint was in 5 different varieties with different punctuation and spacing. The quantity printed was far more than needed for the contest flights. So today it is easy to find mint C2 stamps. The Atlantic Vimy covers all had the Cabot provisional stamp on them, canceled in St. John's between June 10th and June 13th. This is an example of one of the 196 covers carried. The Handley Page and Vickers groups were both preparing to fly in June, but at the last minute the Handley Page group discovered that their radiators were not well matched to the engines sent out from England. So they decided to send for better radiators and wait. Unaware of this development, the Atlantic Vimy crew continued to rush their preparations and departed for Europe on June 14th. The Atlantic Vimy had a difficult flight and at one point almost crashed into the water when the plane spun out of control. But they made it. They flew for about 16 hours and reached Clifton, Ireland, where they saw a wireless station with what looked like a big field behind it. They decided to land there, but the men at the station tried to stop them. They waved their arms, but Alcock and Brown thought they were saying hello and landed there anyway. The field was actually a bog, and the plane quickly got stuck, tilting forward, and was damaged. The plane, the mail, and the flyers were taken to Galway and then to London. There they met the king, who congratulated them on their success and knighted them. The Daily Mail hosted a lunch at the Savoy Hotel in London to celebrate the flyers. The Secretary of State for Air, Winston Churchill, gave them their prize money. The Handley Page and Martinsyde groups heard about the Vimy's victory and had to decide what to do next. The Martinsyde plane was still being repaired, but the crew still wanted to fly across the Atlantic in an attempt to beat the Vimy's time. Upon orders from England, the Handley Page group chose a different course. They were to fly non-stop for 1,000 miles to Mitchell Field, near Mineola on Long Island, New York, and meet the British airship R-34, which was soon to attempt to fly across the Atlantic and back. They would give their transatlantic mail to the airship. The covers with the Cabot stamp C2 that the Handley Page carried were cancelled St. John's on June 9th, like this one, or in Harbour Grace on June 14th or July 4th. Some of their covers had an unofficial oval cachet. On July 2nd, the R-34 departed from England for its historic flight across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Handley Page, equipped with different radiators, took off from Harbour Grace on July 4th, hoping to rendezvous with the airship. However, during the night, one of the Handley Page's engines malfunctioned and was shut down. The plane continued to fly on 3 engines, but with oil leaking. They spotted the lights of Parsboro, Nova Scotia, and decided to make an emergency landing at a small racetrack there. As Major Brackley landed the plane at dawn, it briefly stayed on the racetrack. But with no brakes, the Atlantic reached the curve of the track and went off onto rough ground, damaging the undercarriage, lower wing, and nose, and coming to a stop, tipped up at an angle. This dashed their hopes of meeting the R-34, so they had to send their transatlantic mail by ship. The martensite plane was repaired and ready to fly by mid-July. It carried 25 additional covers with the General Provisional stamp that were postmarked July 12th. On July 17th, the plane, now called Chimera, and with a new navigator, Conrad Biddlecombe, made a second attempt to take off from its airstrip by Kitty Vitty Lake. It flew about 50 yards, but a gust of wind made one wingtip dip and touch the ground. Raynham managed to stabilize the plane, but it crashed down, damaging the undercarriage, fuselage, lower wing, and propeller. The crew, though unhurt, gave up any further attempt to cross the Atlantic and sent the mail by ship. This slide summarizes the Atlantic contest mail carried by the 4 contestant planes. In its second crossing attempt, the martensite plane carried both the original covers franked with C1 and C1A and the supplemental covers franked with C2. The Handley Page had some interesting adventures after it offloaded its Atlantic contest mail. It seems that the American stamp dealer, publisher, collector, A.C. Ressler, made a deal with the crew during their stay in Parsboro to carry the first airmail from Canada to the U.S. These covers had a Canadian 3-cent Admiral stamp on them. The huge plane finally left for Mitchell Field on October 9th. They faced unexpected headwinds, which delayed their flight. When they were over Long Island and almost out of fuel, the crew saw a lighthouse, flew low over the rocks, and landed in a farmer's field at Greenport on the eastern end of the island. Later, they got more fuel and flew across the island to Mitchell Field. The Atlantic spent several weeks in New York, giving plane rides to important people. Then the crew got an offer from American Express to carry 1.5 tons of important cargo non-stop from New York to Chicago. With several passengers, including an American Express representative on board, they departed Mitchell Field on November 14th and flew west over the Catskill Mountains. The freezing cold temperature aloft froze a water pipe to one engine, necessitating a landing in a field near Mount Jewett, Pennsylvania. The American Express cargo was unloaded and sent on by train. The commander of Mitchell Field, who was one of the passengers, suggested that they should make a layover at Glen Martin Airfield in Cleveland. 2 days later, they were back in the air. But their departure was several hours late due to difficulty getting the engine started in the cold. So they arrived in the Cleveland area in the dark and couldn't find the airport. Finally, they spotted the glistening surface of a frozen racetrack in North Randall, about 10 miles away from their intended destination, and landed there. In the landing, again without brakes, they rolled between 2 buildings, clipping off parts of their wings. The mighty Atlantic was finally taken apart and scrapped. So only one of the 4 planes in the Atlantic contest survived, the Atlantic Vimy, the winner of the race. The other 3 planes were destroyed, either by crashing or by being scrapped after crashing. The Atlantic Vimy was repaired and kept for future generations. The Atlantic contest of 1919 is one of the great chapters in the saga of early aviation history. It stands as a testament to the courage and skill of the early pilots who dared to soar in the sky to touch the clouds. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.